I'm tired of the status quo, and I'm sure a lot of you are too. I have good news for you. There's an alternative to the Democratic Party, and that party is corruption. A new party is forming, and their presidential candidate has a lot to offer for progressives. As an attorney, he built a reputation for being passionate and just. He fought hard and often, pro bono, for causes ranging from antitrust and securities to civil rights. As mayor of Salt Lake City, he worked hand in hand with unions, championed the rights of minority and GLBT communities, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions from city operations by 31%, earning him accolades from environmental movement. Since then, he's worked tirelessly for the causes of social and economic justice. He's testified before Congress calling for accountability in cases of torture, and has continued his advocacy for climate protection around the world. In 2011, he publicly denounced the Democratic Party and resigned from it, citing his belief that the same interests pulling the strings of the Republican Party had secured the greens of the Democratic leadership, making it a, quote, gutless, unprincipled party. This man has been awarded such honors as the Sierra Club's Distinguished Service Award, the Drug Policy Alliance's Drug Peace Award, the Morehouse University Gandhi King Ikeda Award, and has been named among the top 10 straight advocates in the U.S. for GLBT equality by Human Rights Campaign, among numerous other honors. The party that's forming is the Justice Party, and this is their candidate for president, Rocky Anderson.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out today. It's a real honor to be here in Harrisburg, and we're going to be heading on to Philadelphia and then New Jersey. I just got through with a great trip in New York and Connecticut, and a lot of what we're doing is focusing on getting on the ballots so that people in this country will have a real choice. So it was amazing. In fact, we started off in Connecticut at the convention of the Independent Party there, where they gave me their nomination and have a position on the ballot. And I received the Independent Party of Connecticut's nomination, so we don't have to go through the almost impossible of getting the requisite number of signatures to get on the ballot. So it was very disheartening to wake up today to see in your local newspaper the headline about the Republican Party challenging Gary Johnson's place on the Pennsylvania ballot. Gary Johnson is former governor of New Mexico, he's presidential candidate of the Libertarian Party, and whatever differences we have, the one thing we agree upon is we should both be on the ballots. We should both be able to challenge this political duopoly. And that's word's thrown around a lot, but it is not an exaggeration. These two parties have done everything they can to exclude everybody else. That is the opposite of what a democracy is supposed to be. It's depriving you of your choices. When you go in to cast your ballot, these two parties want to make sure that there's nobody else there that you can vote for. And in the process, their media is either owned or bought and paid for by the same interests that now buy and pay for these two duopoly parties. But on the road toward the election, they also want to make sure that you don't hear from us either through the media or during the presidential debates. Do you remember, are there any members of the League of Women Voters here, anybody that's been active with them? You'll remember years ago, they were in charge of the presidential debates. They independently organized them, they ran them, they determined where they'd be held, how many there would be, what the format would be, who the moderator was. and who was going to be participating. Remember, they let John Anderson, no relation by the way, except he's a wonderful man, I have tremendous respect for him. He actually, when he was head of the World Federalist Association, I asked him to come out, and he did, come out to Salt Lake City to speak at my first inauguration. But when he was running as an independent candidate for President of the United States, they said, you're invited to the stage, the American people deserve to hear from you as well. And Jimmy Carter said, well, if he's coming, I'm not going to do it. They called his bluff. And for that first debate, there was an empty chair at the debate. Jimmy Carter wasn't there. So what happened? The Republican and Democratic parties came together. The chair of those two parties formed the Commission on Presidential Debates. Presidential Debate Commission is a sole creation of the Republican Democratic parties. You'll see this official-looking seal of the commission, and I know a lot of people think it must be a governmental or semi-governmental commission. It's not. It's another instrument that the Democratic and Republican parties use to destroy your democracy. And they hijacked the debates away from the League of Women Voters. And ever since then, the two candidates of the major parties have determined all of the conditions. They have determined who will participate, when they'll be held, what the format is. It got so bad that when Ross Perot was running the second time around, Bob Dole was scared to death. Because the first time around, when Ross Perot was allowed to debate, his numbers tripled in the polls. That's the kind of difference it makes. When Jesse Ventura was running for governor of Minnesota, he was at 10% in the polls until he was allowed to debate, and he won the election because the people liked what they heard. That's what democracy is all about. But when Bob Dole was running against Bill Clinton, Bob Dole said, I'll do anything to keep Ross Perot off the stage because I know he's going to draw votes away from me. God forbid the American people should have their choice between Ross Perot and Bob Dole. And so he said, you can call the rest of the shots. So the Clinton team said, well, we're up 14%. So we want this to be what George Stephanopoulos later admitted to Chris Matthews in an interview. He said, we wanted it to be as much of a non-event as possible. Imagine presidential debate, and they wanted it to be as much of a non-event, completely unrelated to our interest, the public interest, inimical to our democracy. And so what were their conditions? That there be only 2 debates, that the responses only be 90 seconds, and that they be scheduled opposite the World Series playoff games so nobody would watch them. And that's exactly what happened. They wanted to make sure that Bill Clinton slipped up in the debates. It wasn't really going to have much of an impact. So that's what's happened to our democracy. It's been completely degraded. And in so many other ways, our republic is being degraded. Whenever I hear anybody talk about our republic, I'm reminded of the story. I don't know if it actually happened or not, but it makes a very good point about Ben Franklin leaving the Constitutional Convention. And a woman coming up to him, and she said, well, doctor, what do we have? A republic or a monarchy? I looked at her and said, well, ma'am, a republic if you can keep it. And that is the charge for every single generation, because once we've lost it, it could be gone forever. And I don't think there has been a period in our nation's history when our republic was so much at risk, when it had been so undermined in so many ways, when basic constitutional values have been completely betrayed. When the rule of law, which forms the very core of our system of government, of what a democracy is all about, has been so absolutely undermined by all three branches of government. Just think about it. There were abuses, and by the way, when I talk about this being a transformative period in our nation's history, I'm not saying that there haven't been challenges in the past, but I think the difference has been that when there have been horrible abuses by one or more branches of our government, there has been a sense that we wanted to restore things back to those essential constitutional values. We wanted to get back to the rule of law. We aspire to what really makes America, has made America so great in the past, where we were so proud to be able to distinguish ourselves from other nations where they had tyrannies, where they had dictatorships, where they didn't honor the rule of law. Perfect example of that was during the Cold War, all the abuses by our intelligence community. CIA was opening people's mail without warrants. FBI was engaging in warrantless wiretapping. We know what they did with Martin Luther King Jr., and then they used the information they illegally obtained to try to blackmail him into committing suicide, telling him there was only one way for him to avoid the disclosures, trying to embarrass people that were supportive of the Black Panthers or infiltrating in the COINTEL program. Completely legal organizations that were engaged in anti-war activities, but infiltrating them and in some instances copying off their letterheads and trying to pit them against each other by writing things to make it look like it was coming out of one organization to make other organizations angry with what they were doing, trying to cause this kind of strife in the communities that were opposing U.S. policies. And how do we know all this happened in our intelligence community? Because we had statespeople in Congress and in the White House who cared very much about the fact that these things were illegal, they were violative of our Constitution, and they knew that to get back to our constitutional mores, we needed to investigate what happened and disclose it to the American people and the rest of the world, and then take measures to make sure that we were doing everything we could to deter that kind of conduct in the future. And that's exactly what happened. There were committees in both the House and the Senate that investigated these matters. You may remember, I think the most notorious was the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church from Idaho. And you don't even remember whether these people were Republicans or Democrats, because when it came to these fundamentals, it didn't matter. They worked together to restore the rule of law in this country. President Ford appointed the Rockefeller Commission to look into these abuses. And so they were disclosed, and now we know about them. And so what did Congress do when they found out that the intelligence community was engaging in warrantless surveillance of American citizens? They passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which made it a felony, federal felony, to wiretap, to electronically spy on American citizens' communications without a warrant. So then, we had this reaffirmation. It was a grand moment in our democracy. Then we saw Watergate, and again, statespeople coming together, Republicans and Democrats alike, had the impeachment resolution, and President Nixon was forced from office. And then soon after he was out of office, he appeared on an interview with David Frost. And he said at that time, it's a pretty notorious line that he used. It's notorious because it did appall this nation uniformly. He said, well, if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And then he went on to say, and if those who engage in certain conduct at the president's behest, or people in the executive branch, whatever they do is not illegal if it comes from the president. So the reason that line's so well known is because it did run so counter to what our government is all about, and that is that nobody is above the law. That's what a republic is based upon. And then comes along, years later, George W. Bush, who said at a press conference, telling the American public, no, we respect the Constitution. In every instance, when we wiretap these suspected terrorists, people with connections to terrorism, we always get a warrant. He said that. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on my multimedia presentation on the rule of law. And at the time he said that, for over 2 years, he had ordered the National Security Agency to engage in wholesale spying on American citizens' communications, on emails, on telephone calls, every instance of which, and there were probably thousands upon thousands, every instance was a federal felony, and to this day, not one person has been held to account. Completely contrary to the rule of law. And then he also ordered, he called it extraordinary renditions. He called it every term other than torture. But it was torture. Waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, putting people out into the very cold, to the point that there were some people who died of exposure. This was all contrary to the Geneva Convention. It's contrary to the Convention Against Torture under international law, and also our own domestic law. The War Crimes Act of 1996 and the Federal Anti-Torture Statute, which provides prison terms up to 20 years. And in fact, it provides for the death penalty if somebody dies as a result of torture. Serious offenses. These laws passed by Congress. And so what happens then? Well, we knew that President Bush took the attitude that he was head of the unitary executive branch of government. And to him that meant that his hands couldn't be tied in his war against terror by Congress, by the Constitution. Whatever he said was above the law, that he was beyond that, taking the same attitude that Richard Nixon did. But then comes President Obama. And I think most of us thought that during the Bush years this was an aberration, that there would be, if not a full personal accounting, at least there would be a reaffirmation that the rule of law and the constitutional values. President Obama comes into office and says, when asked about accountability for these violations of the law, he said, well, we should just move forward and not look backwards. That is a complete repudiation of the rule of law. That is an announcement that we have a two-tiered system of justice. We have one tier of rich and powerful people who are not going to be held accountable for war crimes, for illegal surveillance. And now we know that he's taken the same attitude with regard to major financial fraud on Wall Street, having, of course, been the record recipient of Wall Street contributions 4 years ago, and surrounding himself with all these folks from Goldman Sachs and elsewhere on Wall Street during the last almost 4 years. The complete repudiation as a lawyer, a constitutional professor, and was completely undermined any notion of the rule of law and accountability under the law. So you move from that, this idea that because you're president you can violate the law, and now because you're president you person get to determine against whom the law will be applied and under what circumstances? That is the very definition of tyranny. I know that sounds harsh. It's a tough word. We've always been, as I said earlier, proud to distinguish ourselves from other governments that were considered to be tyrannical. We have it now, that kind of a government in the United States of America, where one branch of government takes upon itself the determination as to who will be held accountable and under what circumstances. And then it only gets worse from there. The due process clause. The government may not take anyone's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This president has targeted United States citizens for assassination and actually has achieved the assassination of at least 3 United States citizens. And if you read the newspapers, you probably read there's a whole lot of inches in our newspapers devoted to it, hardly any time on any of the news, of course. But Anwar al-Awlaki was killed by an unmanned drone. He was born in New Mexico, a U.S. citizen, entitled under the Constitution to full due process like any other U.S. citizen. But this president, being that he could decide whether he would live or die. But what you probably didn't read about is that 2 weeks later, Anwar al-Awlaki's son, 16 years old, born in Denver, Colorado, a U.S. citizen, was also killed by a U.S. unmanned drone. And they claim it's because he was present with another target. They won't let much information out. It's always a secret. But we know now of the personal involvement of the president. They call it Terrorism Tuesday, where he joins with others, with his advisors, and they go through these baseball card-like biographies of suspected terrorists and decide on the basis of information from our intelligence community, which, by the way, has been wrong a number of times, in pointing out who might be terrorists, causing the CIA to kidnap Canadian citizen Maher Arar, German citizen Paul al-Masri, both of them totally innocent of any connection to terrorism, one held for over a year, one held for 3 months in an Afghanistan torture chamber in prison. So our intelligence agencies have been wrong before, but based on the information that the president receives from the intelligence community, he decides who's going to live, who's going to die as a result of these unmanned drone strikes, knowing that there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent men, women, and children killed in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan by our unmanned drones. And in the process, we're creating horrendous security problems long-term because of the hatred and hostility growing throughout so much of the world because of what we're doing in those nations, completely contrary to their claims, legitimate claims, of course, of their sovereignty and the fact that we're infringing upon their sovereignty. Can you imagine if in the United States another nation was sending over unmanned drones to kill people that they considered their enemies, and in the process were wiping out innocent men, women, and children here? Is it any wonder? It's like whack-a-mole, but instead of one other mole popping up every time you whack one, another 100 pop up. And that's exactly what we're doing to our nation's security and how absolutely immoral this tradition is going to be viewed in history and going on into other nations, and literally murdering citizens in these other countries. And then the president, that's not good enough for this president and this Congress. And by the way, there's been nary a peep from Congress. Republicans and Democrats seem to all be okay with these massive violations of human and civil rights. Then the president signs off on legislation that he asked for. A lot of people think that, well, Congress wasted this time. No, he asked for it in 2009. He asked for the authority to indefinitely detain people because they might pose a threat to the national security of the United States at some point in the future. Now let that sink in. You suspect that somebody may cause harm in the future, and you're going to go out, and this includes U.S. citizens. That's hard for people to grasp because all of us, from the founding of this nation up until now, this is so absolutely contrary to not only our Constitution, but any idea of what it is to be an American. He's saying that you can go out and kidnap even a U.S. citizen. You can be taken out of your bed in the middle of the night, whisked off to a military prison. Your family doesn't know what's happened to you. Just like Maher Arar and Khalid al-Masri's families didn't know what happened to them when they were kidnapped by the CIA based on bad intelligence. You can be held up to the rest of your life without any charges, without a trial, without legal assistance, and without the right of habeas corpus. There has never been a more un-American subversive piece of legislation passed by a bipartisan Congress and signed into law by the President of the United States. And by the way, he signed it into law on New Year's Eve, when he thought that the American people may not be watching so closely. That is what's happened to our people. And then what about the role of the other branches? Well, we know Congress is just simply aligned on all these issues. The Republicans were there with Bush, and the Democrats hardly uttering a peep, especially after they took the majority. And we heard from Nancy Pelosi almost immediately that impeachment is off the table for these major crimes and the misrepresentations, the lies by President Bush to the people of this country, including Congress, to justify the illegal war of aggression against Iraq. So where are the courts when challenges are made? Well, Maher Arar and Khalid al-Masri. Again, a Canadian citizen and German citizen, both of them kidnapped by the CIA, whisked off, tortured, held for so many months. Again, the families had no idea what had happened to them. They both came in to our federal courts. It's exactly what our Constitution contemplates. If there is illegal, if there are illegal abuses by the executive branch, then people have this recourse. That's what checks and balances is all about. That's what the separation of powers underlying our system of government is all about. It's absolutely fundamental. They come into our courts, and first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration assert what they call the state secrets doctrine. It's a court-made doctrine. It's nowhere in the Constitution. It's nowhere in any laws passed by Congress. But these administrations go into the courts and say, you can't decide these matters. You can't determine whether we, the perpetrators of these offenses, are guilty under the law, whether we're accountable under the law, because to move forward with the cases would mean the disclosure of important state secrets. And we're not even going to prove that to the court. You have to take our word for it because we're the executive branch. And the courts have dismissed the cases. And not only in the area